Okay, so Jeff, why don't you just start out by introducing yourself?
Certainly. So my name is Jeff Bangild. I'm an acting inspector for the Toronto Police Service. I'm currently in the role of duty senior officer.
So tell us, what is a duty officer? I know what a duty officer is, but a lot of people don't know what that is. So just explain your role.
Certainly. So the name has changed over the years, but it's commonly referred to as a duty inspector.
Mm-hmm.
And we provide 24-hour coverage to the city, where we essentially attend all the major calls for service where members of the Toronto Police will be in attendance and ensure that there is an effective uniform response, and that an investigation is being undertaken, and report on any of these incidents through the media so that our community is aware of what's happening in our city.
Right. Okay. So take me back, acting inspector. How many years have you been on the force? Because you look very young, but you've been at the job for a long time. And that's part of the interesting part of your story.
Thank you. Yeah. So I started this job 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I don't know if it's still currently a record, but I was the youngest police officer hired by Toronto when I joined in 1996.
Wow. How old were you?
So I just turned 19. It was about a month or so after my birthday that I got the call from the service that I was being hired.
Wow.
And when I essentially applied for the service, I hadn't even graduated high school yet.
What?
So obviously one of the prerequisites for becoming a police officer in Toronto is that you have to be 18 years of age and have your at least a high school diploma. Mm-hmm. And of course, I was barely squeaking by with that. Wow. So when I presented my application, I handed them my transcript from school. And they said, I don't have my graduation certificate yet, but it's coming. You'll have it in due time.
Wow, so that's ambition.
Yeah.
Okay, so how did you know so young that you wanted to be a police officer? Where did that come from?
In truth, I wasn't sure I wasn't going to be a police officer. I was at that stage in my high school years that I was exploring a lot of post-secondary options, applying through different universities and colleges, but there was not really one program that really hit home. And I came from a small town north of the city, and I had a lot of interactions with police officers at that time. And I always really liked the community embrace to it. They knew everyone. They were always there if you needed them. They were always greeting with a nice smile, and they were very helpful. So my parents had actually seen an article in the paper that the Toronto Police were hiring 300 people. So looking at the experiences that I've had with police officers, I took the opportunity up and gave it a try.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, here I am 25, almost 26 years later, enjoying the role thoroughly.
As an acting inspector. Where did you grow up north of Toronto? What community?
So it's a really small town called Palgrave. I think they still have less than 1,000 people there.
Wow. Okay. So tell me about some of the interactions. You said you had a lot of interactions with police. Sounds like they were positive. What what was a police officer up in Palgrave like? Like what was your impression up there? Well,
again, it's a small town feel. So we had that opportunity that when we interacted with police officers, wasn't always because of something that actually negative that occurred. Mm-hmm. And when I say that, I don't mean to say that every interaction with police can be negative, mm-hmm. but oftentimes we get involved with people that have been in really fortunate situations, be it car crashes or victims of crimes, or even if their car is being broken into and things of that nature. So when you have that interaction with the police officer, when it's a positive context or just happen to be passing by each other on the street or a social context, it really kind of hits home because you have that feel of being part of the community. Mm-hmm. And understand everything that's going on. And I think it's intrinsic of law enforcement and police officers to be part of that community. Mm-hmm. And that's really one that I looked at as kind of something that I want to embrace and partake in as well.
Were you living in Palgrave right up until you were hired with Toronto Police, or was there somewhere in between?
Yeah, no, right up until I was hired by the police, and for a few years after that.
So you came from a community of less than 1,000 people to Toronto Police Service. Like, what was that like? I can't imagine that it wasn't a huge transition for you personally, professionally.
Well, I can certainly say it. If my coach officer happens to be watching this video, he can attest to this, that I was the butt of many jokes because I could not park my car next to a curb. Where I'm from, we don't have curbs.
What?
So trying to park beside it was next to impossible. It was this odd phenomenon that I couldn't actually park parallel. Or if I did, I was about 3 feet away from the curb.
Wow.
Multi-lane road, street lights, streetcars. I've never seen a streetcar before. So working in a small town or living in a small town and then transitioning into the big town was certainly an eye-opening experience. But it was one that I was really thankful to have done. And my first post was at 52 Division, so right downtown Toronto. And that was great for me because it was right in the hub of the city that never sleeps. The lights are always on. There's always noise.
Yes.
There's always something going on. And I really enjoyed my experience downtown.
Okay. So what were some of the things, so that there must've been things that surprised you about policing? You're this 19-year-old kid, 19-year-old man, fresh out of high school, eyes wide, looking at the tall towers of, was it still at University in Dundas, 52 Division? Yes.
Yeah, that's the spot.
So what were some things that surprised you about policing, or was it just as you expected it would be?
Well, in some regards, everything surprised me because, again, my interactions with police officers from my small town are somewhat similar, but also quite different in some respects. And what we don't necessarily see from the public's perspective is what happens behind the scenes and how much information and how much effort is being put in to public safety and how many people are working towards that common goal. And I guess you really just don't see that being a regular member of the public, seeing a police car going by or waving at the police officer when you see them in the street. There's so much involved in policing in so many different aspects of it in terms of support personnel that really brings it all together. So that was the one thing that kind of took me for a bit of a surprise. And secondly is how many people are in Toronto. It is such a massive city, and it's only grown exponentially since the time that I first started the job. There's a period of time when you'd be, on the outside of the city looking in, and there's just cranes everywhere.
Yes.
Massive building that was going on for the last couple of years.
I mean, there still is, right?
There certainly is.
There's a lot of
only grow up.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so I want to just go back for a second, because 19-year-old kid from a small town, I still can't shake that. What did you say to them to make them hire you, or because what do you think that there was something about you that connected with it? Or was it just that they were just looking for as many level-headed, bright young people as they could hire? Then you mentioned they were hiring 300, but I imagine it was still a pretty competitive process back then. So what do you think it was that got you the job?
I think you're right in that regard. And I have a little bit of insight now as to the hiring process because I did work at our police college for a number of years. So I can certainly say that there is a very competitive process to join this job. In terms of what I did to set myself apart from others, I wish I could tell you honestly there was something that set me apart other than the fact that I was young and perhaps malleable. And looking at that ability that I don't really have a great deal of life experience, but I'm really eager to learn and want to do the best that I possibly can. And maybe that just shined through in the interview. And I'm optimistic that is still the case now. And I'm still enjoying this job very much.
Absolutely. You got a smile on your face. Okay. So 52 Division, tell me, where did you go from there? What has your police career been since then?
Well, it's been interesting. And one benefit that I have in Toronto, much like many of my coworkers, is that you cannot get bored on this job. There is so much opportunity to try something new, try different areas of policing, from administrative frontline to executive positions. There's just a lot to undertake. And I've tried my best to take a nonlinear approach to this and get involved with as many things as I possibly can. So divisionally, I've worked at 52 Division, which is where I started, as we spoke about, and in 31 Division up in northwest part of the city. And I spent about 5 years there. And then I spent about 5 or 6 years at 14 Division, which is just west of downtown, but still considered to be part of the downtown core.
Yeah.
In regards to other support units, I've been in the Toronto Drug Squad. I've worked at Intelligence and our Cybercrime Unit, the Toronto Police College, our Analytics and Innovation Unit, Professional Standards or Professionalism and Accountability, and now this current role that I'm in now, the Duty Inspector or the Duty Senior Officer. Has
there been a favorite role through all those years?
It's different. Each one has their pros, each one has their cons. And certainly I can say there is a favorite though that sticks out, and that's my work with the Cybercrime Unit. I was very fortunate that I was sought out with a group of people to actually create our Cybercrime Unit. This is in 2013. And at the time we didn't have one. And the service was looking to modernize our investigative fortitude through the means of cyber capabilities. So I was sought out and was part of this group that actually created our C3 unit. And from that, I worked with the unit after it was created for about 4 years until I moved on from there. And in that 4 years, it was absolutely amazing. Some of the things that we were coming up with and the ability for us to utilize and leverage the internet to better our investigations and to enhance public safety. And it was just fascinating that I got to be a part of that. I was really, really pleased to have done that.
So break that down for me a bit, Jeff. Like, what was the situation with cybercrime and how police were addressing it at the beginning of that 4 years? And what was the difference at the end of the 4 years?
Well, it's not to say that we didn't have capability at the time, but it was limited.
Mm-hmm.
So much like if you consider our child exploitation unit or our mass marketing and financial crimes, certainly they've had a footprint on the cyberspace prior to the inception of C3.
Mm-hmm.
But it was limited because, again, those are certain thresholds for very limited offenses. We couldn't leverage the child exploitation officers to work on, let's say, a homicide investigation,
Mm-hmm.
nor could we use the mass marketing, financial crimes, or fraud unit to work on a missing person.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There were two completely different mandates, but very isolated in their capabilities.
Mm.
So because of that, we look to create the cybercrime unit as a means to address any and all crimes or concerns for public safety.
Mm.
And when we actually created that, that became very apparent very quickly that this has got a niche in policing.
Mm-hmm.
And we were using cybercrime and all of our techniques to find missing persons and to counteract suicidal ideologies and to find people's missing property. Like, people have stolen property that's out there, and we've been able to locate things like that. And there's just a whole range of things that we actually got involved with a cyber lens that was just so fortunate for me to be a part of that.
How do you counteract suicidal ideology through the cybercrime unit? Like, give me an example of that.
So certainly. So I think one of the things is being proactive and looking for that indicia online. And so many of people we come in contact with that have these concerning thoughts are reaching out through social media, or they're contacting their friends or posting information online. Well, through the techniques that we are able to utilize, we can find them very quickly. And sometimes we've actually been able to intervene and save people's lives. And I think that is just one thing that goes unchecked. And really, we don't talk about it because we don't want to personalize it to an individual, but it's not a unique situation. Our investigators who go online have done this countless times before. And I'm very fortunate that we can have that in place and be able to assist with that.
That is so remarkable, because I'd never thought about that. Like, I've heard about cybercrime officers and some of the work that you guys have done. But I think mostly when people think about cybercrime, they do think about, child sexual abuse images and the excellent work that Toronto police officers have done in that realm. And because it gives us an opportunity to see that story, because when children are saved and charges are often laid, and that is why we are made aware of it in the public. But when it comes to you online, and this is the case, I should say too, offline as well, police officers save people all the time, especially when it comes to things like attempted suicide. That is, like, the public would never hear about that, but that must, I mean, it would obviously have a huge impact on the person involved, but I imagine it would have had a big impact on you as well. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. And having a conversation with one individual, and it was a brother of somebody who had gone missing. And we ended up preventing his suicide from occurring. And I remember the brother talked to me on the phone afterwards. He says, "I don't know how you found him. I don't want to know. I'm amazed that you found him." And it was very, very quick. We were able to isolate the exact location of this individual within an hour from the time it was reported to us.
Wow.
So he was just beyond thankful that we had these capabilities in place. And that story is echoed almost daily in some of the interactions that we have and some of the things that we're able to prevent, or, as you alluded to, solve as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So some major heinous crimes have been solved through the work of the cybercrime investigators.
Yeah. Okay. There's so much more I want to explore about your policing, but first, because this ties into it, you reached out to me to take part in this campaign, not to talk about all the interesting things you've done in your police career, not to mention the fact that you're like the youngest ever officer hired in the city of Toronto. You actually reached out about your family. So tell me about your family, Jeff, and what makes your family so special.
Certainly. Yeah, and that's, I think, a really cool nexus between police and my family as well. And it's actually helped me as a police officer in many different ways. So the reason that this came to a head was I was a supervisor in 14 Division. And at the time, I was going through the detective office and working in the Criminal Investigations Bureau. And my wife and I had just had our second child. And I was working midnight shift, and I'd come down the stairs after a brief sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife said, I think our son might be blind.
Mm-hmm.
So rubbing the haze out of my eyes and trying to figure out what's going on, we decided that it'd be, the best thing to do is to seek our family doctor and get some advice on this. So after an examination by the doctor, they referred us to a hospital where an MRI was conducted on our son. And he was diagnosed with a condition called septo-optic dysplasia. At least that's what it was at the time. It's evolved into a lot more since that time, but that was our original diagnosis, was SOD for short form. So not knowing what to do with this, we were obviously shocked. And we have, my son's got an older sister, typically developing, like, how is this going to affect us? What's the long term of this? And there was just so many unknowns and so many variables. So I turned to my boss and I said, I needed a more stable job, something that I need to just kind of keep things regular and predictable so we can figure out what's going to happen with our family. We didn't know it was going to require special appointments or whatever the case might be. So my unit commander at the time said, absolutely, family first in this job. We make sure that we take care of our families and put you in those positions to make things easier for yourself. So from there, from the detective office, I transitioned into our youth and family violence unit, or youth bureau, as it's commonly referred to. And then from that, I started to work on cyber investigations because, again, so many of our children that are out there, I mean, everybody has a cell phone. Everyone has a social media account. I mean, I know there's some that don't, but they'll never see this video because they're not online.
Yeah, exactly. So true.
So those are right. So through that work, I kind of developed this niche that almost every case has some sort of digital footprint to it. And unbeknownst to myself, this is when the service was looking at creating a cybercrime unit. So through some of the work that I was doing and a case that I had actually picked up, a very controversial case involving the internet, it got the attention of our command officers. And I was asked to join this group to create the unit. So I always say that had it not been for my position in the Youth Bureau as a result of trying to find a more stable job for my family, I would have never been introduced to the cybercrime world. So in a loose sort of way, he's the entire reason that I was able to be a part of this and the contribution towards creating the cybercrime unit for the Toronto Police.
Wow. It's like everything happens for a reason. So you mentioned like the initial diagnosis, and your son, like, just tell us, I know you said he had just been born, but how old was he at that time when your wife first noticed that she thought he might be blind, and then to the diagnosis?
So he was 3 months old at the time when he was diagnosed initially with septo-optic dysplasia. And we went through a number of tests afterwards, and there was additional things that kept being kind of added to the diagnosis. So one of the things is he, around the same time, developed infantile spasms, which is a form of epilepsy, and it is one of the most deadly forms that you can get. And every time a seizure occurs, it actually kills brain cells. So now septo-optic dysplasia is a neurological condition, so we need to protect his brain. And obviously seizures can be deadly. So we needed to address that issue. So he was put on a medication, and the medication's side effect, the biggest one, is vision loss. So given the fact that he's already been diagnosed as legally being blind, well, now we're hurting his vision even further, but at the same time, we're protecting his brain. So it was an easy decision to make, but one that we have no control over. It is what it is.
Wow.
So he was on that medication for a period of time. He's since weaned off, and he's always going to have a baseline for epilepsy. But he's been, knock on wood, seizure free for over 10 years now. So we hope that remains to be in place, but it's always a concern. It's something to be mindful of and to watch.
Yeah, exactly. So tell me, like, what is a day in the life like for your son, for your family? Like, what does his condition look like?
So if you were to just have a glimpse of my son, you'd see him. He is an extremely happy kid with a ridiculous set of dimples. And he laughs at everything. He has a thirst for music and a thirst for books. And music calms the savage beast, as they say. And he will look for those opportunities almost nonstop for that engagement. And while he is nonverbal, this creates a bit of a problem for us, because when he's happy, it's obvious. He's laughing, he's smiling, he's carrying on. But when he's not in a great mood, we have to go through a laundry list to find out exactly what's going wrong with him. And sometimes it can be really devastating. And one of the things that was a concern for us is that he has pain of an unknown origin, is what the doctors referred to it as, where he will go through weeks upon weeks of blood-curdling screams, from the moment he wakes up until the moment to bed.
Oh.
And screams that are just as loud as you can possibly muster the strength to do. That's what he does. And it doesn't happen very often, but it's somewhat cyclical and it's going to come around again. So it's trying and it's troubling. And we're doing our absolute best to make sure we get as much care to him as possible. But sometimes he just needs to scream, and it's trying. It's tough to see him like that. But
yeah, I was just going to say, as a parent, like, I mean, your son, okay, so how old is he now?
So he's 11 years old now. He's turning 12 this year.
Okay. So, and when he's screaming like this, it's because he's in pain. It's from this pain. That's what the doctors believe, or it's just an outlet for his situation. You don't know. So
we don't know. It could be a combination of both.
Yes. So you had mentioned this to me in our phone conversation we had a couple of weeks ago. And there was a reason that you brought this up, because it's a lesson that you sort of bring back to your fellow officers. So before we get to that, like those weeks that he is screaming this blood curdling scream from morning until night, what is that like for your family? You said it was difficult, but like, I cannot imagine. I've got 3 kids of my own, and just having a toddler screaming for 10 minutes straight. I'm serious. It sounds so ridiculous saying it out loud, how awful that can be in the moment when I'm talking to you who goes through this. So how do you live with that? Like, how do you survive through those few weeks?
Well, it's become our normal, and we kind of adapted to it and adjusted. And the frequency of them have weaned down considerably. So we're going to stay optimistic that perhaps he's on a spiral down towards not having them at all. But when they do, it's just a matter of being understanding of it. And because we can only pacify so much of it, we have to kind of let it out, or let him let it out. So we do our best, and we try to engage with him. We try to make sure that he's happy, and it's certainly not in a position where he's hurting himself or throwing books around, ripping TV off the wall. But he just tries to scream and get it out that way. And yeah, it is some pain of some nature, but we isolate it. So he's generally healthy otherwise. I mean, there's no concerns that way. So we just have to let nature take its course, so to speak.
So you tell me also the condition that he has now, what you understand of it. Tell me and the audience to this video how rare that is. Just paint the picture with numbers if you can.
Certainly. So this is my son is one of 4 Canadians that have this condition, and one of 200 in the entire world has this condition. That's it. And it's called Bosch-Boonstra Schaff optic atrophy syndrome, or an NR2F1 gene mutation.
Wow.
So it's named after the doctors that coined the diagnosis.
Okay.
So very rare, 1 of 4. And for many years, he was the 3rd Canadian, and we just recently found out that there's a 4th now.
Have you connected with any other families in Canada or around the world that are dealing with this?
Yeah, we certainly have. So we're part of a massive network of people that support each other and lean on each other for information and help. And even prior to that, when he was diagnosed with the septo-optic dysplasia condition originally, when I was in with my boss talking about what was happening, I mean, I was a train wreck. I mean, I was crying my eyes out. I didn't know what was going on. One of my friends, who happens to work in the same division, does a double take and pulls me out of the office and says, "What's going on?" And I explained it to him, and he says, "Buddy, it's all going to be okay. My son has the same condition too."
Wow.
It was the smallest of worlds. So he and I talked for a long period of time. And even back then, his son was a teenager. So I believe he's in his 20s now. And he was explaining everything about what they were going through and what he and his wife had undertaken and come to understand with this condition, and how they've adapted and overcome. And he's, again, prior to me knowing about his son, was such a happy, jovial person. I would have never, ever considered that he is the father or a parent of a child with special needs. And it just resonated that if this person can be so positive and live a normal life with their children, then why can't I either? And I really lean on him for support. And we speak quite regularly now about that.
No kidding. And you mentioned something else, like in our conversation, that I don't remember what the word it was, what the word was that you used to describe it, but basically putting a positive spin on your son's condition, that this is something you've been able to grow with as a family. Whereas as a police officer, you've seen many people whose lives have changed from quote unquote normal to either blind or some sort of, you know, getting their leg amputated or death of a loved one through, be it a collision or homicide. Or tell me a little bit about that and the sort of perspective that your job has given you on that.
Yeah, certainly you hit the nail on the head. And I've been involved with so many cases where that's been exactly what's occurred, is people's lives have developed a certain way for 10, 20, 30 years. And one incident just changes that astronomically to now having to reconsider how to live life. And through assistive devices or whatever the case might be, or therapies, it's a long road ahead and it changes things dramatically. Whereas with us, it was from ground zero. And as soon as we had that diagnosis, we developed as a family moving forward. So we came to realize the best things that were going to help our son thrive and what's going to allow us as a family to make sure that we live a normal life as well. So, and I got to say, my daughter, and I've gone too far without mentioning her, she has been just an exceptional big sister. She helps her brother out all the time. They have their spats like any other normal children will, which is great. But at the same time, she recognizes that there's a time to help him out, you know, with opening gifts or, you know, guiding him by the hand to go up and down stairs. It's happened organically. She's just been such an incredible big sister. So I need to give her some props as well.
How old is your daughter?
So she turned 13 this year.
Okay. So she was two. She was two when your son was born. She was a toddler.
Exactly.
Man, you guys, I can't even imagine. You had your hands so full, working, newborn, toddler, and then to be faced with all of this, my heart just goes out to you. Absolutely. I want you to tell me about now how you took your home life and incorporated it into your work life.
Certainly. So after I left cybercrime, I became an instructor at our police college. And one of the areas that I was responsible for was recruit training. And as you can well imagine, there is a lot of training that goes into a new officer with the Toronto Police. 6 months of training, to be fair. That's not including the road experience. And one of the things that I taught during that course was about my son. And the reason that came to be is one of the previous instructors had taught a portion on autism awareness, be it that it was close to her heart, and she has a member of her family that has autism. So she was due to retire, and they had a discussion, as we always do, about who's going to take over certain courses. And this course came up, so who's going to take over the autism awareness? And without missing a beat, I'm like, I'll take care of it. And they all kind of turned and looked at me like, okay, well, what do you have to offer? So when I explained the history of my son, they just said, well, the choice is perfect, right? So I used that opportunity to speak about, you know, the complexities involved in my son and our family life. And again, it's not to say that anybody in this police service is going to come across the 1 in 4 Canadians that have this condition. That's not the point. The point is understanding the context and why police become involved with the community. And it is so inherently important to the work that we do, is while there's such a huge volume of calls that we attend and so many people that we come in contact with, we still need to understand why we're there. And the example that I use to the recruits is I put a picture up of my son. I said, now this is my son. And you might ask a question as to why I'm teaching this course. And I start to explain everything that's happened. And that he's low vision, he's nonverbal, he's autistic, he's epileptic. And this is what we are faced with. And he screams. So let's say he's in the middle of one of these screaming matches for 3 weeks straight. And I have some fantastic neighbors, and they all understand what's happening, and they're extremely supportive. But one of them had called 911 because of a noise complaint. Maybe they were concerned that my child was getting hurt. And after 3 weeks of screaming, I hear a knock on the door, and there's a police officer saying that somebody's complaining about the noise. Can you expect that my behavior might be a little ornery, that I might be a bit angry as to the presence of a police officer on my front step? More than likely, yes. Right. And it's when I explain it to them in that context, they kind of take a step back and realize, well, yeah, we're only seeing one side of the picture, or there's more to it to understand before we kind of become involved in an enforcement capability. So really, truly understanding what people are going through when they're attending to them makes a world of difference. And it is so incredibly fair to understand that I'm not unique, right? This is not one person in the entire city of Toronto that has some sort of challenge. There are so many people that have special needs children or are caregivers to people that need that care. Sometimes it is tough. And I'm not saying that everything in my life is sunshine and rainbows. We're trying our best, and we do have some really fantastic days. But every now and then, we need that support and we need that understanding from everybody that we become involved with. And just being a part of that from a police officer's perspective, we're part of the community, just like everybody else that contributes to this. And as the expression is, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, Toronto is a village. It might be a gigantic one, but that means that there's more people in it to help. Right? We shouldn't look at this being a drop in the bucket. We should look at the bucket as being this massive support mechanism where we can all help each other out. And it really doesn't take a whole lot to understand somebody's situations and help them. And when's the last time you asked me, can I help you? Is there something I can do for you? And having that perspective for our new recruits really hits home.
Yeah. And like further to what you were saying, in that situation, whether it's you with your screaming son for 3 weeks straight, or any other parent in Toronto who has a special needs child and maybe like sort of at their wit's end with whatever situation they're dealing with, that police officer at their door could very well be their breaking point and could create a totally different situation. So, I mean, what do you tell these recruits then? Is it just about saying like, what can we do for you? Or what do you hope that they learn from that? And in terms of how to react to situations then, because as far as they know, they're just going to a noise complaint, somebody screaming in that house, right? They don't understand they don't understand what the background is.
Yeah. And sometimes we might not. And some people may not divulge that information, which is fair. But when you have that opportunity, again, because we are a public service, we have so many people involved in public service that all it takes is a phone call. And we have so many resources at our fingertips that we can reach out, and maybe they just don't know where to turn to. So asking that question, is there anything I can do to help? Sometimes they will respond and say, well, sure, but where do I start? You can start the ball rolling. We have access to that information. And even going back to my days in the youth bureau, I remember dealing with one family specifically. I'd been called to a school and their child had some condition I won't get into too much. And the mother would just look at me and says, I don't think you understand what's happening here. You don't get it. You don't understand the complexities. And I kind of smiled and I says, I can appreciate your position, but I do understand. And when I explained everything that was happening with my son in my life, I said, I could see myself in your shoes too. I could see a police officer being called to my son's school because of a concern that's being raised as well. And her jaw dropped and her eyes lit up. She goes, I've never actually had anybody say that they do understand it and without having to explain it. Says, you truly get where I'm coming from. It changed the perspective entirely. And not to say that the situation was there was any different, but there was certainly a better communication between all of us that were involved, because while I might be an intermediate, I get both sides of it. And I truly understand that. So it certainly has been a connection between everything that I've learned as a parent to a child with special needs and police officer for 25 years. There's a great nexus between the two.
You mentioned that your predecessor in that role at the police college had retired. I didn't realize until I spoke with you that police officers, that new recruits receive training about things like autism, or, you know, you present even a more complex perspective, but special needs kids and that sort of thing. How long has that sort of training been going on for? Is it something that you received when you started on at 19 years old?
I don't remember. No,
so but if you did, it wasn't anything that was that meaningful, I suppose, right?
Fair point.
Yeah.
It certainly predates my time at the police college. So it's been probably at least 10 years this training's been occurring. And sometimes it takes an event to spur certain pivotal change in our training. And in this one particular case, it involved an individual that was denied access to a restaurant because she had a service dog with her. And when she attempted to get the police to intervene, she was met with the response that, well, it's not a police matter, really. It's more of a civil matter. But again, being a person with a service dog, she knew full well that, no, this is an enforceable act by the police. So it was raised at, like, what training did the police receive in terms of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act? And it was met with a very stern, well, I don't think we really cover it. So it became a very catalyst moment for us to say, we need to include this training, because again, this is not a unique situation that we're never going to be called to ever again.
Mm-hmm.
The likelihood of us having to go to a location where somebody's being denied entry or whatever the case might be, when it falls within the AODA realm,
Mm-hmm.
our officers need to be made aware of that. While there's hundreds of acts and different legislations and laws that are out there, we can't know all of them. We can't know all of them thoroughly, but we at least need to be understanding of there's a place and a resource for it, and that it is something that the police can action and should be actioning.
Let's talk about pick up on this a little bit more, because what you just said was very interesting, that, you know, sometimes something bad needs to happen in order to spur change. And, you know, I feel like there might be members of the public who are saying, well, you can't just wait for something bad to happen before you change. You know, like there's people, of course, that are always calling for change in policing and everything. And certainly Toronto Police Service has been changing a lot. But where do you land on that? Like, can you expand a little bit more on that, of the reality of change coming from bad things that happen sometimes?
Yeah, certainly. And again, the police aren't the lawmakers, right? So we can't necessarily drive the change on a moment that we've encountered, but we have to be attuned to the concerns of the public and address it in a fair approach. So sometimes a law might be certainly there and written, it might not be applicable. Mm-hmm. Or conversely, there might not be a law in place, but action needs to be taken. So to say that we're waiting for change in order to drive our change is not perhaps correct. As we look for those opportunities, most certainly before they occur, but sometimes it does result in an event occurring. And some tragedies have occurred globally, have spurred major changes and social movements. But it's not the onus on the police to drive that change. Sometimes it is a societal change. Sometimes it is a legislative change, and we can be a part of that. But we have to be, again, attuned to the needs of the public and make sure that we address them as best as we can, given the context.
I think that cybercrime is such like a prime example of that. There's been so much changing in that realm, like from when you started working in cybercrime to now. Like, you think of some of the big cases. I'm not going to name them here because I don't want to draw undue attention to something if their families aren't okay with it. But you think of some of the cases that have come up just over the last decade, and how that has changed things with legislation, and also just with, you know, calls to hold social media bodies to account, you know, and like that still remains such an exciting space to be in. Are you still working in the cybercrime stuff? I know you're currently in the duty office, but do you still have your hands in that? Are you still lecturing on it? Are you still learning about it?
Yes to all the above. Yeah, so I'm still in the realm, certainly not as deep as I was before, but I'm still involved in that type of work. And it is extremely odd how it all changes so rapidly. And much like a DNA type of a case, back when DNA first became an evidentiary value, I mean, of course, there was so many concerns about how it was obtained and how we can analyze it, but then it just became second nature. DNA becomes part of every major investigation. And cyber is getting to that point as well. But again, when we created this unit in 2013, the internet had already been around for 20 years. So we are 20 years behind having the capabilities of addressing crime that's occurring online. And when I present it in such a perspective like that, you have no choice but to adopt it, because we're missing that key piece. And as a member of the public, if we come forward with the police and this occurred to me, how can we look them in the eye and say we don't have that capability to address it? So it was a necessary change, and perhaps one that was spurred by global events and things that have occurred even locally. But it was one that everyone was already working towards to begin with. So, you know, we certainly got ahead of it as best as we could, and we now have a full-fledged operational cybercrime unit that's been operational for a number of years now.
I'm just curious, as somebody who has worked so heavily in the social media space, like it's a big part of the cybercrime stuff, somebody who's on social media, how do you feel about social media? Like, do you like social media? Do you consider it a positive thing, a negative thing? Like, where do you fall on that debate? It's something that always comes up.
Yeah, I'm a little bit hit and miss with it. And when I first started getting involved in social media work, I had accounts on every platform, and I was heavily providing heavy content into it and making sure that I keep up to date with it. But then just became so overwhelming for me. because I spend all day investigating social media and cybercrime, but then I'm also contributing to it from a social perspective and off the job as well, that it became daunting. And it's not that I stopped seeing the positivity to it or the benefit that came from it. It just became trying to do the same job day in and day out. And it's like looking at an executive chef. They spend cooking 12 hours a day. They come home, they don't want to cook. They're going to order a pizza. Yeah. That's all it comes down to. Right?
Yeah, it's such a good analogy. I've heard chefs say that before. Okay, so I want to pick up on something else that you mentioned earlier in the conversation, talking about how it takes a village, and Toronto is a village. And you made that comment coming out of, like thinking about that child who's in a home who might have special needs or whatnot. I want to pick up on that comment though, in terms of like policing and taking care of the community in general. What do you think because there's been a lot of talk about police modernization, policing is changing, certainly, and we can talk about this more if you like. Policing has changed a lot since you became a police officer back in the 90s. But what do you think the community's role is in safer communities? Like what's the police role? What's the community role? How should they be working together or separately?
Yeah, and I think working separately in anything is not the proper approach. And we can't engage in public safety unless there's a collaborative approach across all levels, from the community itself to the police, to the government stakeholders, to the provincial level, to federal, and everybody in between. It really needs to be that piece. It's like holding on to a piece of information. And if you're not willing to provide that, the information itself is redundant and useless. And having that partnership is beneficial. And I make the example when I'm talking to the police officers is when I say to them, what do you think the big problems are within a community? And they will likely say gun violence, gang activity, drugs, impaired driving, and things of that nature. Some very heinous, heavy crimes. But when you talk to the community, the biggest concerns they often have is noise complaints, quality of life calls, disturbances in the area, and erratic driving. So why do we miss the mark there? And how could we know what the police officer's perspective is unless we talk to them? How do we know what the public's perspective is unless we speak to them as well? But when we put them both at the same table, regardless of what the crime source is or what the concern is, that's when it becomes apparent to both sides. Like if we were to say, well, we didn't know there was noise complaints in your area. We didn't know that there was field right behind your house. Now that we know that, we have resources in place to deal with that. It needs that cohesion before we can apply to anything and get measurable change.
And are those sorts of conversations at bringing all the parties to the table, is that happening a lot more often now than when you started 25 years ago, would you say?
It's tough to say. I don't know for certain, but I do know, and this is kind of a plea to everybody, is understand that every division that services the community that you live in has what's called a Community Police Liaison Committee, or a CPLC. Find out from your local police station how often they run and how you can become involved in it. Because they are essentially town hall meetings that are held on a regular basis where these issues are discussed. So it's been a number of years since I've actually worked within a division itself, but I do know that those meetings are still occurring on a regular basis. And our city is growing exponentially. So I would think by design, the population of a CPLC meeting should be growing as well. So get engaged and really come out. And even if you want to vent, even if you're about something, you need to hear about that. The only way that we can help you is if you let us know that there's a problem to be addressed.
You are obviously a big community guy, big community policing guy. I think the word community has come up many times in this conversation. How much of that do you attribute to your upbringing and in a small town where police officers knew everybody knew the police officers? And how much of that do you attribute to your experience as a police officer actually working the streets of Toronto?
So certainly there's a piece that can be attributed to both. And I remember specifically working in Jane and Finch in 31 Division. An officer that I worked with there had spent most of his career on foot patrol in the Old Weston Village. And to that point, when we would have our lunch breaks, we would go back to that area, get out of our car, and we'd walk around with a coffee for an hour. And people to this day, or to the day of, remembered his name. They'd come up and they'd talk to him. They'd shake hands. They'd tell them about the old times or what's going on in their neighborhood. This is in 2006, somewhere in there.
Wow.
This is still going on. So Toronto still has millions of people in it, but in 2006, still know their local police officer. Right? We wouldn't have got that if we didn't get out of our police car.
Yes.
We wouldn't have got that if we're just doing our job by going to the radio calls and addressing those calls for service.
Yeah.
Get it? That's part of the job.
Yeah.
But really getting to know the people in your community plays so much more into this. And that, I think, comes from my small town country boy role, is that I knew everybody around me, right? And it wasn't that you couldn't go down the street and you just knew everybody. Everyone was met with a high five and a handshake and a tip of the hat. Right? It's just a small town way of going about things.
Do you go back there to Palgrave, right? Do you go back there? Do you go back there often or ever?
Yeah. So I have to go back because they just got their first street light.
Are you serious?
Apparently they have a signalized intersection now, which never actually occurred at the time that I lived there.
So do you think that this is going to see just like a swarm of people, like expats coming back to the town to see the new street light? You're going back for it yourself?
It'd be worthwhile to launch a social media campaign all over it again.
Yes.
Yeah, it's big news.
You'll have to bring your kids out there, take some pictures next to the street light. That's awesome. Jeff, is there anything else you want people to know about yourself or policing or police officers that you work with?
I could go on for a while. There's so much about this. And one thing I really enjoy about this campaign that you're running is that there's just so many different perspectives that we see across all different levels of this organization. It might be cliche to say we're just like you, right? Our families are no different. Well, but there's some truth. My parents emigrated here in 1969. I'm a first generation Canadian. And there's a lot to be said about that. And you don't know about somebody unless you actually start to learn about them. So we're trying our best to learn our communities, and our communities are trying their best to learn about us as well. And there's just so much dynamic lives that have come to play here, that we're not just police officers, and we don't look at you as just members of the community. We really want to work together. And I think there's just so much to learn about how other officers and other members of the service actually engage with that.
Why is that important though? Why do you, I mean, obviously I think it's important or I wouldn't be doing this, but there's going to be people who are watching this or who are choosing not to watch this, who don't see the importance of getting to know you, Jeff, outside of your role as an acting duty inspector. Why do you think it's important that members of the public get to know the police officers that serve them?
I think when they truly get to understand and appreciate that we are trying to help. And there are over 7,000 members of the Toronto Police Service. So the likelihood of seeing an officer more than once in one of those emergency type situations is few and far between. But when you're engaging with us in those meetings or those, when we're walking on the street and having a coffee, those are the times to understand that we're approachable. You can talk to us, and we're going to tell you what our concerns are in the public and what's happening with us, just the same as we want to talk to you and learn about what's happening in your community. And we are not just a union of police officers. We are individuals. We all have different backgrounds and different concerns, and we need to monopolize on those. And you get to know your police officers by engaging with them and speaking to them and learning what they're doing within the community. I think that's really important. And it goes back to that thing that you were mentioning earlier, that it's that cohesiveness and that cooperative approach to public safety that really is necessary with an understanding of both sides of the equation.
You wear like a darker color shirt now as the duty inspector out on the streets. Do you still feel like a barrier though when you show up at a scene, because you go to a lot of scenes right now where emotions are very high? You're essentially going, from one emergency call to the next. Do you still feel that barrier just by virtue of you wearing the uniform, or by the constables or sergeants on scene of them wearing their uniform? Do you still see that barrier between police and the communities?
I think that there's an initial reaction that is automatic upon seeing a police officer. And let's use the traffic accident as an example. If you become involved in a collision, the police are going to attend, and that they've got a role to do as well. So there's always going to be that, oh, great, the police are here, or I've done something wrong, and you can see that. But there's also the human side to it as well. And not to say that every interaction is going to be happy and cordial. Emotions are going to run high, but sometimes just stepping outside of the world that you're in and having a conversation, even if it is a troubling time, can certainly bring the emotions down a little bit. And we're not necessarily there because we're trying to be a bad person or engage in enforcement efforts. We just have to be there to make sure that everybody's safe. And just as an example, even just last night, I was working midnight shift, of course, and I was driving in some side street and I saw a woman in a broken down car with the hazards flashing. And I spoke to her for a little bit, and she says, my car's broken down. My husband's on the way here with the tow truck. I said, well, do you want to just stick here until he arrives? And she has a breath of fresh air. She's like, that would be wonderful. Thank you. So I parked my car behind hers. And I kept my lights on to make sure that everyone saw the car was there and it was nice and safe. Her husband showed up. He got the car off to the side of the road. And she just said, thank you. That was incredible. Thank you so much for staying here. So just because I was there doesn't mean that people need to be tense. Right? The police are part of the community, and we are doing everything that we can to make sure that everyone has that feeling of relief that we are there, and we are contributing to a safer community.
Would you say that your views are the exception or the expectation? Like, would you say most people that you work with in the service feel the same way?
I truly think so. And when we are working with police officers and when they're brand new, they have the desire, and they really want to make an impact. They really want to be the catalyst for change. That doesn't go away. And sometimes we get involved with such heinous offenses, and we see trouble a lot, and it is tiring, and it is stressful, but we keep persevering. We really do want to become change managers. We want to be part of that positivity. I don't think any police officer or member of the service goes into this job thinking, I can't wait to make everybody miserable, right? Nobody operates at that level. We do get involved in really bad situations where it makes us really question, can I really keep doing this? And the answer to that is always yes. They always keep coming back, and they always continue to work. And it's always with the public safety perspective in mind.
What sort of bad situations are you referring to? Like, what would make somebody question, or has there been anything that has made you question whether you could stay in the job?
It's tough. It's very situational. I've been involved in so many investigations over the years, and I've seen so many horrible situations that they're tough to see. And I don't know how many times I've been to a morgue or to having to spoke with a family member that their loved one has passed on. It is very trying, and it's very emotional. And again, it can be somewhat cyclical, and it's not going to be a one-time situation where you tell a family member that they've lost somebody. You're not going to just see one collision. You're not going to see one person who's been injured by gunfire. It happens frequently. And that frequency, I think, makes people understand that we're trying our best, but sometimes maybe it's just not hard enough. And we try to be positive, try to continue working and striving hard, but sometimes you got to sit back, and some people will. And I've done it myself. I said, I don't know if I can keep doing this. I'm trying so hard, and it just keeps happening. But again, we do keep trying. We don't give up. We're part of that community. We have that oath, and we need to continue striving towards making sure that we've done everything that we can for the public.
Yeah, I was speaking with Staff Superintendent Mark Barkley the other day, and his profile will probably roll out before yours does. So some people may have already seen it, but he was telling me about, when he started on as an officer, it would be like a huge deal if you responded to a shooting call. You might respond to maybe one or two in an entire year. Whereas now there are platoons in Toronto who are performing life-saving measures on one shooting victim one night, and then life-saving measures on another shooting victim the next night. So I don't know if that is that's the sort of thing that you might be referring to, Jeff, but how do you, I know that you're very community minded, but tell me more about where that conversation goes. What keeps you in this job? Because I know you want a good community, but you're also a human being. And those sorts of traumatic exposures can take their toll on your physical health, on your mental health. So what has been your, I guess, recipe for success through the years in safeguarding your mental health so that you can continue through?
Yeah, and I think it really just falls back on that inherent skill set that all police officers have, that we are out there doing our best that we can to stop crime from occurring. And you hit the nail on the head. Shootings are more frequent. There's no surprise about that. And I think it was 2 nights ago, I was working a midnight shift and I went to 4 shootings during the course of the evening. And
Wow.
that's over the very short period of time. And that's from Etobicoke all the way to Scarborough. And I was going, and I don't recall that happening 25 years ago. You know, they did happen, certainly, but nowhere near the frequency that they are now. And maybe we can attribute that to the population growth. I don't know, but really, when it comes down to is, like I spoke about before, is that village mentality. Right? Why aren't we just spending more time just trying to help each other out? Why do we have to take these such violent strides in life? I get that people have beefs. I get that people have concerns, but it's just so inherently violent. There's no need for it. Right? We need to take it down and just calm ourselves. And perhaps that's what's driving me personally, is maybe there's something I can do to prevent these from happening that are not an enforcement-based activity. Mm. Maybe there is, and maybe every officer has a different approach to this. And they always have those, what can I do? Right? What else can I do to contribute to this? How can I make the city better? Mm-hmm. And I think that's really what keeps us going.
Your current role as acting duty inspector is inherently a reactionary role, though, right? Something bad happens and you're called to basically make sure that all the resources are there, everything that you were explaining before. So what do you see your role as now in preventing something like gun violence in the city of Toronto?
So that is what my mandate entails, but that doesn't prevent me from going to community meetings and getting out of my car and actually walking around, or when I am at these events, speaking to the people that were there that are by these incidents. And that has been really critical. Addressing the police response is somewhat second nature. We all know what to do. We all have the resources in place. We know the notifications need to be made, but when that's done, I'm still there and I can still talk to those people and still talk to the business owners and find out if they're okay. And learning from them what's occurring in their communities is what allows me to have communications with other people. Mm-hmm. So while my moment there is fleeting and I don't normally police that area, I can certainly at least report to the people that are there on a regular basis that these are the concerns that were raised last night when I was at that incident. Mm-hmm. This is what the community is feeling. This is what the business owners are saying. This is what the school boards are telling us. This is what the politicians and the councilors have brought to our attention. So it's stepping outside that role of being a responsive unit to actually being engaged when I'm at these events is what I use to drive that change. So I use those opportunities, the times of darkness as we speak, to bring some light into it and to try to get a better understanding as to what's occurring.
I think that's really cool to think about a duty inspector on scene, just having conversations with people. You're not just standing there on your cell phone and I know there's a lot of work you got to do on your cell phone when you get to those scenes, but I love the idea of, what else can I do? I wanted to ask you, because you said your parents immigrated to Canada. Where did they immigrate from?
So they come from Copenhagen.
Oh,
and the decision was to Canada. Yeah, we're Danish, and very small family again in Denmark, and most of my family is still in Copenhagen. Wow. My brother and his family are in the United States, mm-hmm. and my parents are here in Ontario still. But the intention for them is they were going to come here to learn English for a year. And after that year transpired, they called back home and said, no, it's too good here in Canada. We're going to stay.
Really? I feel like people are always talking about how good it is in Denmark. So that's good to hear. So
yeah, I've been back in times, and it is a great country. There's no question about that.
The reason I wanted to ask that is because one thing I love about these conversations, it's so interesting how many people I've been talking to, how many Toronto police officers are first generation Canadians. And I think that has got to be something that really makes, when you look at police services really around the world, because Toronto is so diverse, it is so culturally rich. It really is I'm seeing that reflected in the police service, and it's whether you're a first generation Canadian or people from a wide variety of socioeconomic backgrounds. but I just think I guess this isn't really a question. Maybe you have a comment on it, but I just think it is so cool that so many people I'm meeting that is not part of the conversation at all are either first generation Canadians or they've got some sort of backstory that it's one of those cities where you can really see. And I know this has been like an effort of Toronto Police lately, but you can really see like the police service reflecting the community it serves. And I don't know, have you noticed that more recently, or did you notice it when you started on 25 years ago?
Yeah, 25 years ago, it was even apparent then that we're making those changes to hire a representative. But now so much as like the last time that I was actually in a division and I was in charge of a platoon of officers, every day that I'd start them, I'd have to give them their details for the day. And I had with me a list of their languages. And it took longer to write down their language skills than to write down the details that they had for the day.
Really?
It was just incredible. And, I'd hear over the radio, somebody would say, does anybody on the air speak Farsi? Does anybody on the air speak Urdu? And 25 years ago, maybe not, 30 years ago, perhaps. Mm-hmm. But now it's like, yeah, I can, or I can. There'd be 3 or 4 people jumping in and offering their language skills to that call for service. Mm-hmm. And that's such a great thing to have at our disposal, because when you have a diverse city, it has to be met with the same representation for that exact reason. Mm-hmm. How can we communicate with each other if we don't speak the same language? And
literally,
while I don't speak Farsi,
literally, yes.
Right. So now I can have at my disposal officers that speak every language, that come from every corner of the earth, all working within the same city. In that core group of 7,000 members, we have that representation. It's a great thing to have.
It's really, I honestly, I'm being totally candid here. I just think it's so cool. It is so cool. And I know it's happening across all different first responder communities. I remember going to a firefighter graduation years ago, and there were people there that spoke like 4+ languages in a class of, 24 or something like that. And I see the same in policing, and it's so cool. Anyway, Jeff, is there anything else that you'd like to talk about? Anything that we haven't touched on that you wanted to discuss?
No, I think it's been a great conversation. I thank you for opening the door to this opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you for being a part of it. It has been like such a pleasure speaking with you. And yours is one of the names that I followed you on social media for a while. I had no idea about your personal life, your son, your daughter, your wife, your family life. This has been such an enlightening conversation with me because as you tell the new recruits, like there's always a reason, there's always a story behind that door. And I thank you, Jeff, for showing us your reason, the story behind your door. And I send all my best to your beautiful family.
Thank you so much. And I'll certainly send my thanks to them as well for allowing me this opportunity. So thank you.
Absolutely.